Most people believe the British Empire was defeated, that somewhere out there, in a jungle, in a desert, on a beach, an army finally beat it, that the empire fell the way empires are supposed to fall, loudly, under fire. But that isn't what happened. In the year the empire covered nearly a quarter of the planet's land surface, no rival navy could touch it, no coalition could invade it. And when the empire finally ended, it was not because it had lost a war, it was because it had won them. The most powerful empire in human history did not die on a battlefield. It died in a ledger. It was dismantled, quietly, methodically, by a series of decisions its own leaders made, each one defensible at the time, each one reasonable, each one designed to save the empire, and every single one of them moved it closer to the end. This is the story of how a superpower spent itself out of existence, and the strangest part isn't that it happened, it's that they could see it happening and did it anyway. To understand the collapse, you have to start at the summit, because the summit is where the fatal habit was formed. Turn the clock back to 1900. Britain is not simply the world's strongest military power, it is the world's bank. Roughly half of all international trade at the time was financed through London. Sterling was not one currency among many, it was the currency, the thing every other currency was measured against. When a merchant in Buenos Aires shipped beef to a buyer in Hamburg, the paper that made it possible ran through a London clearinghouse. That is a level of dominance that's almost impossible to picture today, and it created a belief so deep nobody thought to question it, that Britain could always pay, that whatever the crisis, whatever the cost, the money would be there. Over the next 60 years, that belief would be tested 4 times, 4 moments, 4 decisions, and each time Britain would choose prestige over solvency, and each time the bill would arrive later, larger, and harder to pay. The first test came at the very peak, and almost nobody saw it coming. In October 1899, Britain went to war in southern Africa against 2 small republics of farmers. On paper, it was a formality, a police action against an opponent with no navy, no industry, no allies of consequence. British planners expected a short campaign. It lasted almost 3 years. It eventually required somewhere around 450,000 British and Imperial troops, and it cost the Treasury well over £200 million, a figure that dwarfed every peacetime assumption in the budget. The Boers refused to fight the war Britain had planned for. They dispersed into mounted raiding columns, struck supply lines, vanished into the landscape, and the British response, under Kitchener, was to try to drain the water the fish swam in. Farms burned, and civilians moved into internment camps. Roughly 28,000 Boer civilians died in those camps, the majority of them children. Tens of thousands of black Africans died in separate camps, and for most of the 20th century, their deaths were barely counted at all. When the reports reached London, the reaction wasn't only moral outrage, it was something colder. A creeping recognition that the empire had just spent 3 years, an enormous sum, and a great deal of its reputation, to defeat farmers. The victory was real, the invoice was real too, and the invoice was the part that mattered. Because a system that could no longer afford small wars was about to be handed the largest war in human history. Here's the detail that almost never makes it into the story of the First World War. Before the first British soldier reached France, the financial system nearly died in London, in a matter of days. In late July 1914, the machinery of global credit ceased. The stock exchange shut its doors. The Bank of England's reserves came under immediate strain. The Treasury had to improvise emergency measures to keep the bill market breathing. The empire's greatest strength, being the hub of world finance, turned out to be a vulnerability nobody had priced in. Then came 4 years of industrial slaughter, and the deeper transformation began, not in the trenches, but in the accounts. Britain didn't just fight the war, it financed the alliance. It borrowed to buy American steel, American food, American shells, and it lent onward to allies who could not pay cash. J.P. Morgan and Company became Britain's purchasing agent in the United States, brokering an extraordinary flow of war materiel across the Atlantic. And somewhere in the middle of that war, without ceremony, the axis of the world quietly rotated. Britain had entered 1914 as the largest creditor on earth. It came out of 1918 owing enormous sums to the United States. The nation that had financed everyone was now the one asking for terms. By late 1916 and into 1917, British officials were privately warning that their capacity to keep buying in America was approaching its limit. The empire still had the fleet, it still had the map, but the leverage, the actual power to make other countries do things, had begun migrating westward across the Atlantic. Britain won the war. And here is the thing about that victory. It did not feel like a warning. It felt like vindication. The map got bigger after 1918. New mandates in the Middle East, new responsibilities, new garrisons, more territory, less money, a wider empire defended by a shrinking balance sheet. That contradiction had to break somewhere, and the man who broke it was the most famous Briton of the century, years before anyone thought of him as a hero. In 1925, Winston Churchill made a decision that economists still argue about a century later. He returned Britain to the gold standard, and, crucially, at the pre-war exchange rate, the old rate, the imperial rate, roughly $4.86 to the pound. Here's what that actually meant, stripped of jargon. Britain declared that its currency was worth exactly what it had been worth before 4 years of war, before the borrowing, before the inflation. It was a statement about status, not arithmetic, and it made every British product instantly more expensive for foreigners to buy. Coal, steel, ships, textiles. Overnight, the industries the empire was built on became harder to sell. The economist John Maynard Keynes attacked the decision publicly, in a pamphlet whose title alone told you the argument. He framed the policy as something the country would pay for in unemployment and industrial pain. Interpretations still differ on how large the overvaluation was, and some historians argue the decline of British export industries was already underway. But the direction of the pressure isn't much disputed. To defend the pound, wages had to fall. And wages falling is not an abstraction. It's a mining family in Durham being told the pay is being cut and the hours extended because a number in London has to hold. In 1926, that pressure exploded into the general strike. Millions out, the country locked in confrontation with itself. Britain endured all of it. The deflation, the unemployment, the strike, the bitterness that would poison its industrial politics for decades. And then, in September 1931, with the world in depression and reserves draining, Britain abandoned the gold standard anyway. Everything that had been sacrificed to hold that line, the wages, the jobs, the social peace, bought 6 years and then evaporated. Churchill himself later called it one of the worst decisions of his life. But the pattern it revealed was the real damage. When forced to choose between appearing powerful and being solvent, Britain chose the appearance. Every time. And it was about to make that choice at a scale that would end the empire outright. There is no version of this story that criticizes Britain for fighting in 1939. Fighting Nazi Germany was the correct decision, morally and by any measure that matters. But the financing of that decision is the part almost nobody talks about, and it is where the empire actually ended. By 1940, Britain was running out of dollars. It had begun selling its overseas assets, the accumulated investments of a century, the very holdings that made it a creditor nation, to buy weapons. Then, in 1941, the United States passed Lend-Lease, and the flow of supplies continued without immediate payment. Lend-Lease saved Britain. It also transformed it. Because the terms of survival were set in Washington now, and Washington had its own long-term view about the future of imperial trading blocs. The empire ran on a system called imperial preference. Member territories traded with each other on favorable terms, and outsiders paid more to get in. It was the commercial skeleton holding the whole structure together. American negotiators wanted it dismantled, and the wartime aid agreements pushed, in careful diplomatic language, toward exactly that outcome, the reduction of discriminatory trade barriers once the fighting stopped. So consider what Britain was actually signing. supplies now, in exchange for gradually surrendering the economic architecture that made the empire an empire, rather than a collection of distant coastlines. There was no alternative. That's what makes it tragic rather than foolish. But the price was written down, in plain English, while London was still burning. But the most extraordinary financial fact of the war is one that rarely gets mentioned at all. To fight, Britain bought vast quantities of goods and services from its own empire: food, materials, labour, bases, and it largely paid with IOUs, credits accumulated in London and known as the sterling balances. By the end of the war, those balances were enormous. India alone had built up claims running into the billions in the money of the day. Sit with that for a moment. The colony was now the creditor. The empire owed money to the territories it governed. The entire logic of imperial extraction had inverted, and it had inverted while the flags were still flying and the maps were still red. In 1945, Britain stood among the victors. Parades, church bells, a seat at the table where the post-war world would be designed. And inside the Treasury, officials were looking at the books with something close to panic. One senior figure described the country's position in 1945 as a financial Dunkirk. They knew. Before the celebrations had finished, they already knew. Days after Japan's surrender, the United States abruptly ended Lend-Lease. The lifeline stopped, and Britain, victorious, exhausted, bombed, and effectively broke, had to go to Washington and ask for a loan. The negotiations were led on the British side by Keynes, and they were brutal. Britain got the money, billions of dollars, on long terms, but it came with a condition: sterling would have to be made convertible into dollars. That clause looked technical. It was actually a demolition charge. In July 1947, Britain honoured it and made the pound convertible. Holders of sterling around the world did the obvious thing. They converted, en masse, into dollars. Reserves drained at a catastrophic rate. Within weeks, convertibility was suspended. Look at what else happened in that same period, and the picture stops being about currency and starts being about the end of an era. In early 1947, Britain informed the United States that it could no longer sustain its support for Greece and Turkey. Weeks later, the Truman Doctrine was announced, the United States picking up a strategic role Britain had held for over a century. That handover was not negotiated at a summit. It happened because London ran the numbers and concluded it couldn't afford the responsibility. That August, India and Pakistan became independent. In 1949, the pound was devalued, from $4.03 to $2.80. By the early 1950s, the empire on the map was still vast. The empire in the accounts was already gone. The only thing missing was the moment the world found out. That moment came in 1956, and it lasted about a week. In July 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal Company. For Prime Minister Anthony Eden, this was intolerable. The canal was the artery of empire, the route to India, oil, and Asia. Britain, France, and Israel arrived at a coordinated plan. Israel would attack, Britain and France would intervene as apparent peacemakers, and control of the canal zone would return to European hands. Militarily, the operation worked. Forces went in, objectives were taken, and then the United States did something that ended the British Empire more decisively than any battle in its history. It did nothing military at all. Washington opposed the operation, and pressure was applied where Britain was weakest: sterling. As reserves hemorrhaged in a run on the pound, Britain sought emergency support through the International Monetary Fund and found that American backing for that support was tied to a ceasefire and withdrawal. There was no invasion, no blockade, no shot fired between allies. There was simply a quiet indication that the money would not be there. And there was a second squeeze, just as effective. The canal itself was blocked with scuttled ships, and Middle Eastern oil stopped moving along its usual routes. Within weeks, the country that had launched the operation to protect its access to oil was rationing petrol at home. An empire that could not fuel its own cars was not going to police a continent. Within days, Britain agreed to withdraw. Eden resigned shortly afterward, his health and his career finished. And every government on earth drew the same conclusion at the same moment. British power now required American permission. The empire didn't end with a surrender, it ended with a margin call. Over the following 15 years, the flags came down across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean. In 1968, Britain announced it would withdraw its military presence east of Suez, a formal acknowledgement of what the ledger had decided years earlier. In 1962, the American statesman Dean Acheson summarized it with a line that stung precisely because it was accurate. Britain had lost an empire and not yet found a role. So what actually killed the British Empire? Not Germany, not nationalism alone, not any single enemy. What killed it was a structural trap that great powers seem to walk into again and again. Commitments grow faster than the capacity to fund them, and the gap gets covered with borrowing, because borrowing lets you keep looking powerful while you become weaker. Habsburg Spain drowned in silver and defaulted repeatedly while still ruling half a hemisphere. The pattern is old. And notice something uncomfortable about every decision in this story. Fighting the Boers, financing the alliance, restoring the pound, standing alone in 1940, holding the canal, almost none of them were stupid. Several were necessary. One was heroic. The empire wasn't destroyed by a villain or by a blunder. It was destroyed by the accumulated cost of defending a position it could no longer afford to hold, and by the very human refusal to admit that, until the market admitted it first. Which raises the question this story leaves in the room. Britain's leaders had access to the numbers the entire time. They employed the finest economists alive. They were told, repeatedly, what the arithmetic meant. They understood it, and they still could not bring themselves to act on it, because power is not only a strategic asset, it's an identity. And no country in history has ever voluntarily downgraded its own self-image. So here's the thought I'd leave you with. If the strongest empire on earth could see its own decline in the ledger and keep spending anyway, what makes any of us think today's superpowers are reading their books any more honestly? Tell me in the comments which decision you think was the true point of no return, 1925, 1941, or 1956. I read them. And if you want the rest of these stories, the collapses, the reckonings, the moments the money quietly decided history, that's the whole archive. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.